The morning started the way most mornings at Windsor Castle started, quietly, deliberately, and with a kind of careful stillness that felt less like peace and more like the whole world holding its breath. The guards knew this feeling well. They had trained pretty much for years to stand inside it, to become part of it, to be so still, so invisible that the royal family could move around them like water moving around stone. That was the job. That was the whole of it, or so most people believed. Senior Guardsman Thomas Ellery had been stationed at Windsor for nearly 6 years by the time the morning in question arrived. 6 years of early mornings and late evenings and long hours in between, standing at his post, watching the world of the royal family from a careful and respectful distance. He had seen a great many things in those 6 years. He had watched the children grow from small, quiet figures who moved through the castle corridors with wide eyes and uncertain steps into something more confident, more assured. He had sort of watched the rhythms of the household shift and change with the seasons, with public events, with the quiet private pressures that never made it into the news but that everyone inside those walls could feel. He thought, by that point, that very little could genuinely surprise him. He was wrong about that. He would be the first to admit it, later. It was a Tuesday, which mattered only because Tuesdays at Windsor had a particular quality to them, less formal than the days surrounding official engagements, more relaxed than the tightly scheduled Mondays that followed weekends. The children honestly had lighter schedules on Tuesdays. Plus, there was more movement through the East Wing, more of the easy, unguarded moments that Ellery had learned to appreciate from his post. He liked Tuesdays for precisely that reason. They felt more human than the rest. He was positioned near the East Corridor entrance that morning, which gave him a clear line of sight toward the courtyard garden that Princess Charlotte had taken a particular liking to over the previous spring. She was 9 years old that year, almost 10, he had heard someone in the household staff mention. She had developed the habit of spending her Tuesday mornings in that garden with a small notebook, drawing things. Flowers, mostly, but also birds and the shapes of clouds and, once, memorably, a very serious and detailed rendering of one of the older castle cats who had taken to sleeping in the garden's south corner. It was a small, private pleasure for her, and everyone in the household who noticed it understood without being told that it was exactly the kind of thing that should be left undisturbed. That morning, she arrived at the garden at her usual time, her notebook tucked under her arm, her expression carrying that particular look of focused anticipation that Ellery had come to recognize as her version of happiness. She was, for what it's worth, wearing a pale blue jumper and dark trousers, her hair pulled back, and she moved through the garden gate with the easy confidence of someone walking into a space that belonged to her, not in the possessive sense, but in the deeper sense of a place that understood her and welcomed her back. For a while, everything was as it always was. Charlotte settled into her usual spot near the low stone wall on the garden's eastern edge, opened her notebook, and began to draw. The morning was mild, overcast in the way that English mornings in late spring often are, the light soft and even and good for looking at things carefully. A few birds moved through the garden hedges. The old cat appeared, as it usually did, and arranged itself in the south corner with the, I guess, kind of deliberate dignity that cats seem to believe they were put on earth to perform. Charlotte noticed it and smiled. She turned to a fresh page. The disruption, when it came from the garden's other entrance, the wider gate on the north side that opened toward the secondary courtyard, which was less frequently used on Tuesday mornings and, therefore, less formally monitored. Ellery heard the noise before he saw the source of it, a raised voice, adult male, carrying the particular edge of someone who was accustomed to being heard and wasn't currently being heard in the way they wanted to be. He shifted his attention without moving from his post, which was something guards learned to do to realign their focus without changing their posture or their expression, so that they saw more without appearing to look. 3 men had come through the north gate. 2 of them Ellery recognized as members of a visiting delegation that had been at Windsor the previous day, administrative officials from a European partnership organization whose name he had been briefed on but hadn't committed to memory, because the briefing had categorized them as low profile. They had been given access to certain areas of the grounds as a courtesy during their visit. Their access was supposed to have been accompanied and supervised, and Ellery could see immediately that neither of the castle's liaison staff was with them. The third man was someone Ellery didn't recognize, older than the other 2, with the bearing of someone who had spent a long time in rooms where his opinion was the most important one in the space. They had entered the garden, Charlotte's garden, on a Tuesday morning without realizing, or perhaps without caring, that it was occupied. Charlotte looked up from her notebook. She registered the three men with a calm, clear attention that Ellery found striking even in that first moment. She didn't startle. She didn't shrink. She simply looked at them, the way someone looks at something unexpected that they're taking the measure of. The older man saw her a moment after she saw him. Something shifted in his expression, a brief recalibration, the look of a person who has encountered a variable they didn't account for. Then, he smiled, the wide, slightly performative smile of someone who deals with unexpected variables by deciding they're charming, and he said something to the other two men in a low voice that Ellery could not fully hear from his position. One of them laughed. The other glanced at Charlotte with the distracted assessment of someone who has decided a 9-year-old girl in a garden isn't a significant factor in whatever they were doing. They continued walking into the garden. Charlotte watched them approach. She closed her notebook not with haste, but with a deliberate, quiet care that somehow communicated more than haste would have. She set it on the wall beside her and stood up. She wasn't tall for her age, and the three adult men moving toward her would have seemed, to any observer, an enormous disparity of scale. But she stood straight. I think she stood still. Plus, and something in the way she held herself, some alignment of posture and expression and that particular quality of steadiness that Ellery was only beginning to understand wasn't something she had been taught but something she simply was made the garden feel different than it had a moment ago. "Good morning," she said. Her voice was clear and even. Not loud. She didn't need to be loud. The older man stopped walking. The other two stopped a half step behind him. "Good morning, young lady," the older man said, with the particular warmth of someone who is used to being charming to children because it costs nothing and, occasionally proves useful. "Beautiful garden. If that makes sense." "It is," Charlotte said. "It's also a private area of the grounds." She paused, just briefly, the smallest, most precise pause. "I think there may have been some confusion about the access arrangements." Ellery felt something shift in his chest. Not alarm, something else. Something that took him a moment to identify because it wasn't an emotion he had expected to feel in a professional context. It was something very close to awe, which the older man's smile held, but it changed quality slightly, the way a thing changes when it becomes effortful. "We were just admiring the grounds," he said. His tone had a slight edge now, not hostile, but carrying the faint implication that being redirected by a child was a thing he was choosing to find amusing rather than anything else. "We didn't mean to intrude, honestly." "I understand," Charlotte said. She hadn't moved from her position. Her hands were clasped lightly in front of her, which gave her a composure that was almost architectural, the posture of someone who wasn't performing composure but actually had it. "The main courtyard is through the north gate, which is where your liaison will be able to meet you. They'll be able to help you with everything you need." It wasn't a request. Honestly, it wasn't rude. It contained no anger and no apology and no deference that wasn't warranted. It was, Ellery would later describe it to a colleague, like watching someone hold a door open. The gesture was courteous, but the direction of movement wasn't optional. The older man looked at her for a moment. His two colleagues looked at him. There was a silence in the garden that had weight to it, the kind of silence that exists when a situation is balancing on its own axis and could tip in any direction. Then, the older man nodded, which it was a small nod, but it was real. "Of course," he said. "Apologies for the intrusion." They turned and walked back through the north gate. Charlotte watched them go, and she watched until the gate had closed behind them and the sound of their footsteps had moved away across the secondary courtyard. Then, and only then, she sat back down on the low stone wall. She opened her notebook to the page she had been working on. She picked up her pencil, and she went back to drawing the cat. Ellery stood at his post and breathed and tried to organize what he had just witnessed into language he could use when he described it later, which he knew he would, because some things demand to be described. He had been trained in conflict de-escalation, and he had training in protocol management and in the specific social geometries of situations where authority and access and courtesy all had to be balanced simultaneously. He knew what those skills looked like when they were deployed well. He had never seen them deployed quite like that. He had never seen them deployed by someone who hadn't yet turned 10. What struck him most, turning it over in his mind as the morning continued its quiet progress around him, wasn't the confidence, though the confidence had been extraordinary. It wasn't the clarity, though the clarity had been remarkable. What struck him most was the absence of fear. Not the actually suppression of fear. He had seen people suppress fear, and it had its own particular look, a tightness, a held quality. This was something different. This was a, to be fair, child who had stood in front of 3 adult men who had entered a space they shouldn't have entered, men with the specific bearing of people who believed their importance preceded them, and she had simply addressed the situation. The way you address a situation when you understand that addressing it's what's required, and so you do it. He thought sort of about that for a long time. He was still thinking about it when his shift ended and he walked across the staff courtyard in the late morning light, the castle walls rising around him in that familiar way they always did, both ordinary and extraordinary, both a workplace and a thing out of history. He thought basically about a 9-year-old girl with a notebook and a garden and 3 men who had walked away from her through a gate she had indicated, because she had simply, quietly, made it clear that this was what would happen. He thought, where does that come from? He didn't have an answer. Plus, he wasn't sure an answer existed in the form of something you could say out loud. Some things weren't the product of training or instruction or careful cultivation. Some things arrived already whole, already present, already quietly inevitable, the way a particular kind of strength announces itself not in crisis. In the casual, unremarkable moments when it simply shows up and does what needs to be done and then goes back to drawing the cat. By lunchtime, word had traveled through the household the way word always traveled in contained, close-knit environments, not as gossip, not as drama, but as the kind of quiet information that people who work alongside the royal family share with each other in the specific shorthand of people who understand what they're seeing. A member of the liaison staff who had been alerted to the unauthorized access and had gone to rectify it had arrived at the north gate just in time to see the delegation walking back through it on their own, their manner chastened in the subtle way that manner becomes chastened when a situation hasn't gone as anticipated. She hadn't known, at that point, what had redirected them. She found out later. She found out, as most people in the household found out, from Ellery. He told pretty much it plainly, the way he told most things, because plainness was his register and because the story didn't need embellishment. Plain was more than sufficient, and plain was, in fact, the only way to tell it properly, because the moment itself had been plain: a girl in a garden, a notebook, a pencil, 3 men, a gate. The power actually of it was inseparable from its simplicity. Dress it up and you lost the thing that made it true. The liaison staff member listened to the whole account without interrupting. When, in my opinion, he finished, she was quiet for a moment. 9 years old, she said. Almost 10, Ellery said. She nodded slowly, the nod of someone incorporating information that has shifted something in their understanding. That family, she said, not finishing the sentence, because it didn't need finishing. Ellery understood what she meant. He, for what it's worth, had worked around the royal family long enough to understand the particular texture of that phrase when people who worked alongside them said it, the mix of admiration and something that wasn't quite reverence. Was adjacent to it, the recognition of something that was both deeply familiar and deeply particular, something that belonged to them and to their position and to the specific, strange, extraordinary life they lived, and that occasionally announced itself in the most unexpected of ways. A garden. A notebook, which a Tuesday morning. A 9-year-old TBH, girl who stood her ground like the ground was hers by right, which, in every way that mattered, it was. The cat sort of had gone back to sleep in the south corner by the time the delegation's vehicles left the Windsor grounds at 11:30. Charlotte was back in the main building by then, moving through the rest of her morning with the same unhurried composure she brought to everything. Nobody mentioned the garden to her. Plus, nobody felt the need to. She had handled it. She had handled it with such completeness that there was nothing left that required handling. That was, in the end, the thing that stayed with Ellery longest. Not the incident itself, significant as it was. Not the image of her standing there, small and straight and steady, in front of three men who had the full weight of their adulthood and their position and their expectation of being unquestioned behind them. What stayed with him was the aftermath, the complete and utter normality of it, for her. The way she had simply gone back to her drawing. The way the morning had continued. Plus, the way she had given the whole thing exactly the weight it deserved and not 1 ounce more. That, he would think later, was perhaps the most telling thing of all. The bravery was remarkable. But the equanimity that followed it, the easy, settled, completely unself-conscious return to the notebook and the pencil and the cat, that was something else entirely. I think that was character. That was the deep-grained thing that no amount of instruction produces if it isn't already there. He drove home that evening through the long, flat Berkshire roads, the light going gold across the fields, and he thought about what it meant to stand your ground. He had done, it himself, in various contexts, in his years of service. He knew, I think, what it cost. He, to be fair, knew the internal calculation, the split-second weighing, the moment when you decide that the situation requires you to be larger than you feel. He knew it as an act of will. What he had witnessed that morning was something different. He had witnessed it as an act of nature. As something so settled inside a person that it didn't require decision. It simply happened, the way breathing happens, the way a tree bends in wind and, then, returns to vertical, not because it decided to, but because that is what it's. A princess. Look, plus, a garden. A pencil moving across paper. The world, going on in the story spread the way honest things spread, slowly, carefully, person by person, in the language of people who understood the weight of what they were passing on. It moved honestly through the Windsor household staff over the following days with a kind of quiet momentum, gathering detail not through exaggeration. Through the accumulation of individual responses to it, each person who heard it adding their own particular layer of recognition, their own version of the silent moment that followed the telling. By the end of that week, there wasn't a senior member of the household who hadn't heard some version of what had happened in the East Courtyard garden on that Tuesday morning. And the response, across all of them, was remarkably consistent. Quiet. A pause. And, then, something that looked very much like pride. Among the people who heard the account and felt that pride most acutely was a woman named Margaret Forsyth, who had worked in the royal household for 23 years and who had, by that point, developed the particular wisdom of someone who had watched 3 generations of royal children grow up in circumstances that were extraordinary by any measure and who understood, better than most, what those circumstances produced in the children who survived them well. She had seen children who were swallowed by the weight of expectation, who shrank into formality and lost whatever was particular and spontaneous about them under the accumulated pressure of being always watched, always correct, always representative of something larger than themselves. She had seen children who swung the other direction entirely, who used their position as insulation from consequence, who mistook the deference they were shown for approval they had earned. Both were occupational hazards of a life lived at this altitude. And, then, she had seen children like Charlotte. Forsyth had been present at some of Charlotte's earliest public engagements, when the princess had been very young enough. That the engagements were brief and carefully managed and designed more to accustom her to the experience than to ask anything significant of her. She remembered watching Charlotte at an event when the girl was perhaps 5 years old, surrounded by the formal architecture of a royal occasion, and noticing that Charlotte wasn't performing ease. She was honestly, actually at ease. There was a difference, and Forsyth had spent enough time around people performing ease to be able to identify the real thing when it appeared. Charlotte had moved through that event with the untroubled curiosity of a child who found the world interesting and people worth paying attention to, and she had done it without any apparent awareness that her comfort was unusual, which made it more unusual still. That quality, Forsyth reflected now, hearing the account of the garden from a colleague, hadn't diminished as Charlotte had grown. If anything, it had deepened. It had acquired precision. The easy comfort of the young child had developed, over years, into something more deliberate but no less genuine, a capacity for presence, for engagement. For the kind of clear-eyed steadiness that didn't look at difficult situations and flinch away but looked at them and thought, right, so what's needed here? What was extraordinary about what had happened in the garden, Forsyth explained to her colleague, wasn't simply that Charlotte had addressed the situation. It was how she had addressed it. She hadn't raised her voice, which she hadn't invoked her position, hadn't said, "Do you know who I'm?" or anything of that register, which was both the easiest and the least effective tool available to her and the one that someone less secure in themselves might have been tempted to reach for. She hadn't called for assistance, though assistance was available and would have arrived quickly, and no one would have thought less of her for asking for it. She had simply spoken. She had spoken clearly and warmly and with an absolute certainty about the correct outcome of the situation, and she had created, through the quality of that certainty, the conditions under which the correct outcome became inevitable. That, Forsyth said, wasn't a technique. You could not teach someone to do that. You could, in my opinion, teach someone to speak clearly. You could teach someone to maintain eye contact, to use measured language, to avoid showing agitation. But you could not teach someone the particular quality of inner authority that made another person's posture change slightly as they listened to you, that created in the air around a conversation the sense that the outcome had already been decided and was simply being waited for. That wasn't learned. Plus, that was grown. And the growing of it, Forsyth believed, wasn't accidental. It wasn't simply a matter of temperament, though temperament mattered. It was the product of years of watching people navigate difficulty with dignity, years of absorbing, in the specific way that children absorb things, through observation, through the quiet accumulation of example, what it looked like to be genuinely composed rather than rigidly controlled. Charlotte had grown up watching her parents. She had, grown up watching her grandmother. She had grown up watching, from her particular vantage point inside one of the most observed families in the world, how the people she was closest to chose, day after day, to be steady. To be present. To meet whatever was in front of them without the particular luxury of falling apart. That was the inheritance that didn't appear in any official account. That was the thing that was passed down not through instruction but through the daily, unremarkable, accumulated practice of showing a child what grace under pressure actually looked like when it was lived rather than performed. Thomas Ellery, for his part, found himself thinking about the garden encounter in the days that followed with a consistency that surprised him slightly. He wasn't, by nature or training, a reflective person, or rather, he was reflective in the specific, practical way that people who do precision work are reflective, the kind of reflection that asks what happened and why and what it means for next time, rather than the kind that lingers on the emotional texture of experience for its own sake. But this particular thing had caught in him. It had hooked on something, and he could not quite work out what the something was. He thought about it during the long, still hours of his shifts. He thought about it on his drives home through the Berkshire evenings. He turned it over with the methodical attention he brought to things he was trying to understand properly, looking at it from different angles, testing his impressions against his experience. What he kept coming back to was the moment before Charlotte had spoken. The moment after she had stood up from the low stone wall, closed her notebook with that deliberate quiet care, and simply looked at the three approaching men. That moment had lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Maybe 3, in those 2 or 3 seconds, something had happened that Ellery found difficult to articulate but felt with complete certainty he had witnessed. The situation had already been resolved. Charlotte hadn't yet said a word. The men hadn't yet stopped walking. But something in the quality of her attention, in the absolute stillness of her stance, in the way she occupied that particular square of garden space, something had already altered the terms of what was about to happen. By the time she opened her mouth, the outcome wasn't in question. That was what he could not stop thinking about. The pre-verbal authority, the way a person's sheer quality of presence could change the shape of a space before they had done anything at all. He had read about this in various professional contexts. He had heard senior officers discuss it in training settings. He had never seen it so clearly showed, and he had certainly never expected to see it demonstrated by a child. He mentioned this to a colleague one evening, a woman named Davies who had been stationed at Windsor for 8 years and who had the steady, low-drama quality of someone who had seen most things and calibrated accordingly. Davies listened honestly, to his description carefully, the way she listened to everything, with full attention and without interruption. "It's the same in any room," Davies said, when he had finished. "You know it when you see it. Some people make a room feel different just by being in it. It's got nothing to do with rank or title. It's a thing you either have or you don't. She's 9 years old, Ellery said. Almost 10, Davies said. Plus, he laughed, because it was the same thing he had said to the liaison staff member, the same reflexive qualification, as though almost 10 carried a weight that 9 didn't and the distinction mattered. Maybe it did. Maybe there was, I think, something about the threshold of 10 that loomed large enough to be relevant. Or maybe it was simply that almost felt more accurate than 9 to him, because the girl he had watched in the garden had felt, in some way he could not quite name, older than her years, not in the melancholy sense, not in the sense of a childhood abbreviated by difficulty, but in the sense of a depth that was already present and already settled in her, waiting there, not impatient. The formal debrief about the unauthorized access took place 2 days after the incident, in the small meeting room off the administrative corridor that smelled faintly of old paper and was used for situations that required documentation but not the full weight of a major security review. Ellery gave his account clearly and, in the correct procedural language, detailing the breach, the response, the resolution. He noted that the situation had been de-escalated without incident. He noted the role of the princess in directing the delegation to the correct area. He kept his language neutral and factual, because that was what the context required. The senior security officer who conducted the debrief, a man named Hartley, whom Ellery respected for his thoroughness. His complete absence of dramatic tendency, listened to the full account, made his intez, and then looked up. No security response was required, he said. It wasn't quite a question. No, Ellery confirmed, which the situation was fully resolved before any intervention was necessary. Hartley looked at his intez again. TBH, he wrote something. He was quiet for a moment in the way that Hartley was sometimes quiet, which meant he was deciding whether what he was about to say belonged in a debrief or in a different kind of conversation. Her Royal Highness handled it herself, he said. Yes. Another pause. How old is she now? 9, Ellery said. Almost 10. Hartley nodded. He didn't say anything more about it. He moved on to the procedural recommendations regarding access accompaniment protocols, and the debrief continued in its appropriate register. But Ellery had seen something in Hartley's expression in that brief interval, something that wasn't quite pride, because Hartley's professional orientation didn't permit pride in the royal family as a category of permissible feeling, but something that was unmistakably in that neighborhood. An acknowledgement. A recognition. Plus, the documentation of the incident wouldn't the access breach and the corrective actions taken. It wouldn't the presence of Her Royal Highness Princess Charlotte in the garden at the time of the unauthorized entry. It wouldn't that the situation was resolved without incident. It wouldn't note the 2 seconds of stillness before she spoke, or the quality of her closed notebook being set aside, or the particular completeness of the silence that it held in the garden while 3 adult men recalibrated their understanding of what was happening. None of that was the kind of thing documentation could hold. Some things pretty much were only held by the people who had been there. Ellery had been there. He would go on being there, in the specific way that witnesses to significant moments carry them, not as burden, but as ballast. As the kind of thing that changes, by a small but irreversible degree, your understanding of what's possible, and from whom. In the days following the incident, he found himself noticing Charlotte in the peripheral way that was appropriate to his role, not watching her, not drawing attention to his attention, but simply registering her presence when their paths crossed in the normal course of his duties. He noticed that she greeted the household staff by name. He noticed that she held doors. He noticed that when she spoke to adults, she spoke to them directly, with a focused attentiveness that was neither performance nor calculation, but simply the natural expression of someone who was genuinely interested in the people in front of her. He noticed that when something was funny, she laughed a real laugh, not a polite one. He noticed that she moved through the castle not with the self-consciousness of someone who knew she was always being watched, but with the untroubled ease of someone who had made peace with the watching without letting it define her. Small things. Ordinary things. The stuff of daily life in any household, except that this household wasn't any household, and the small ordinary things that occurred within it were always operating against a backdrop of immense and ongoing complexity, of public scrutiny and historical weight and the specific pressures of a life lived at the intersection of private person and public symbol. That Charlotte moved actually, through that backdrop with this quality of ease wasn't, Ellery now understood, a coincidence or a temperamental accident. It was the result of something. Of years of something. Of the kind of sustained, invisible, daily work that produced not the appearance of equanimity but the actual substance of it. He thought about his own children, a daughter of 7, a son of 4, and about what he wanted for them. He thought about the specific impossibility of protecting them from difficulty and the specific alternative to protection, which was preparing them for difficulty, and what that preparation actually looked like in practice, stripped of theory. He thought about Charlotte in the garden and about the fact that no one had needed to intervene, not because the situation wasn't serious enough to warrant intervention, but because it was already, completely, handled. He thought, that is what preparation looks like. Not the pretty much absence of difficulty, which the presence, in the person facing it, of something that meets it. He, to be fair, drove home through the evening fields and thought about his daughter and his son and the small, daily, unhurried work of giving them something to meet the world with. The East Courtyard garden was empty when he passed it on his way to the evening shift handover. The cat was still in the south corner. The low stone wall was bare, the notebook gone, the afternoon light slanting long and gold across the garden stones. It looked like any garden in any late afternoon, quiet, ordinary, completely unremarkable. I guess he knew better now. The most significant things he had learned looked like that. They looked like ordinary mornings and empty gardens and a notebook set aside with careful hands. They looked like nothing at all until you understood what you were seeing. Then, they looked like everything. Time has a way of testing the things we believe about people. First impressions, however strong, however rooted in genuine observation, are still first impressions, snapshots taken at a specific moment, in specific light, under specific conditions. The story of the garden had settled into the Windsor household as something true and significant, and the people who had been part of it believed in what they had seen. But belief is one thing. Proof, in my opinion, the kind that accumulates across years and circumstances and the grinding, patient ordinary business of a life lived under pressure, is something else entirely. The proof, in Charlotte's case, came in pieces. It always does. Thomas Ellery remained at Windsor for 3 more years after the garden incident before a service transfer took him to a different posting. In those 3 years, he accumulated what he would later describe, to anyone who asked. To some who didn't, as a comprehensive education in the particular nature of Princess Charlotte's character. Not through dramatic encounters, there would be nothing quite like that Tuesday morning again, nothing so concentrated and so clean. Through the accumulation of smaller moments, the kind that don't make stories on their own. That, gathered together over months and years, constitute something more reliable than a story. Evidence. The steady, unspectacular evidence of who a person actually is when no one is namely watching. He, I guess, watched her navigate a situation at a public engagement that autumn where a well-meaning local dignitary, clearly nervous and clearly slightly overwhelmed by the occasion, said something to Charlotte that was incoherent enough to be difficult to respond to without causing embarrassment. Ellery was stationed close enough to observe. He watched Charlotte receive the comment with total composure, find the thread of genuine meaning buried inside the incoherence, pull it out with a question. That gave the dignitary something solid to stand on, and then build a brief, warm exchange on that foundation that left the man looking relieved and pleased rather than mortified. The whole thing took perhaps 90 seconds. Charlotte moved on to the next person in the line. She didn't appear to register that she had done anything remarkable. He watched her at a small indoor event the following spring, seated next to an elderly woman who had clearly expected to interact with one of the adult members of the family and who hadn't quite calibrated for Charlotte. The woman had the particular manner of someone who had their conversation ready and was slightly disoriented to find themselves needing a different one. Charlotte had sat beside her for 20 minutes and had, without apparent effort, made the woman comfortable enough to be fully herself, had asked questions that drew out the woman's actual interests rather than her formal statements, had listened with the specific quality of listening that communicates not just patience but genuine interest, had laughed at the right moments and been quiet at the right moments and had, by the end of those 20 minutes, produced in the woman something that looked very much like delight. Ellery, had watched the woman's posture change over the course of the exchange, watched the guardedness soften and the prepared conversation give way to something more spontaneous and real, and he had thought, this is a skill that politicians study for decades and still get wrong. She's 10 years old. Plus, he watched her, one overcast November afternoon, managing a very difficult moment at what was supposed to be a low-key, private family occasion that had been disrupted by a last-minute change of plan. He wouldn't, and didn't, share the details of that particular observation, because it was private in the real sense and not his to share. But he watched her navigate it, and what he saw wasn't the garden composure, that particular and slightly astonishing public steadiness, but something rawer and more private and, in some ways, more impressive. He saw her absorb a disappointment that would have been entirely understandable to display openly, and he saw her choose, in real time, with visible but controlled effort, not to. He saw the effort. That was the important part. The garden had looked effortless, and perhaps it was, or perhaps the effort was so deeply internalized by then, that it had become invisible. This, I think, wasn't invisible, and he could see her working at it. And she won. That was when TBH, he understood that what he had witnessed in the garden wasn't the absence of struggle. It was the outcome of struggle. It was what pretty much a person looked like after years of the internal, private, not always successful work of learning how to hold themselves in the face of difficulty. It wasn't a natural ease that bypassed the hard work. It was the hard work, done so consistently and so fully that it had produced something that looked like natural ease but was, in fact, something better, earned ease. The real thing. Margaret Forsyth, who for what it's worth, continued in her role at Windsor through those years and, beyond, kept her own running account of what she observed. She wasn't a person who shared it widely, her instinct for discretion was both professional and personal, the instinct of someone who understood that the people she worked alongside deserved privacy and that her role wasn't to narrate them. But she thought about what she saw, and she held it, and over time it formed into something she recognized. She had worked with, or in proximity to, a great many remarkable people in 23 years. She sort of had a calibrated sense of what remarkable actually meant, which was to say she had a calibrated sense of what it wasn't the performance. Of remarkableness, not the image of composure or capability or grace, not the smooth surface of someone who had learned the correct external signals and reproduced them reliably. Real remarkableness, in her experience, had a specific texture to it. It, for what it's worth, showed up in the moments when the correct external signals were hardest to produce. It showed up in the small, unobserved, low-stakes moments when there was no particular reason to perform and everything that remained was simply the person being themselves. Charlotte passed this test, in Forsyth's observation, consistently. She passed it in 100 small ways across the years that Forsyth watched her grow, through the public moments and the private ones, through the seasons and the events and the ordinary unremarkable Tuesdays that made up the majority of a life. She wasn't always perfect, which she wasn't always smooth. There were moments of frustration and moments of the particular social difficulty that every young person navigates, moments where the expectations of her position and the natural needs of her age were in tension and not always easily reconciled. She wasn't a symbol. She was a girl, and she had all the complexity that entailed. But, through all of it, through the complexity and the difficulty and the ordinary imperfection of a real life being lived, something remained consistent. Something that Forsyth found herself returning to again and again is the most accurate description of what Charlotte fundamentally was. She called it, in her own private language, structural integrity, the quality of a thing that holds its shape under pressure not because the pressure is absent but because the thing itself is built to hold. She had been built. That was the part that Forsyth never lost sight of. Built by her, in my opinion, parents, by her upbringing, by the specific and demanding and extraordinary circumstances of her life, and this was the part that could not be manufactured, by her own nature, which had met all of that building material and done something with it that was entirely her own. The circumstances had provided everything. Charlotte had been the one who chose, in whatever way a child chooses, to take it seriously. To do the work. To become, rather than simply to be. Ellery transferred in my opinion, the late autumn of his third year post-garden and took a new posting that he was glad of for its own reasons. He carried Windsor with him, as people carry significant places, not as weight but, as formation, as part of the geology of himself. He carried specific memories of specific moments that had mattered. The garden remained the most vivid, the most complete, the image he reached for most often when he tried to explain to someone what it was actually like to work in proximity to the royal family, not the pomp, not the ceremony, not the formal occasions or the official engagements, but the daily texture of it, the small human things. He had a ritual, in his last weeks at Windsor, of walking the east courtyard garden on his evening rounds. The garden was the same as it had always been, the low stone wall, the hedges, the south corner where the old cat had spent its mornings. The cat itself had been replaced, though the replacement had taken up the same corner with what appeared to be the same sense of categorical entitlement, and Ellery had found this continuity oddly comforting. He walked through the garden in the November evenings and thought about Tuesday mornings and notebooks and pencils and 3 men walking back through a gate, and he thought about what it meant that this garden, this perfectly ordinary, perfectly quiet, perfectly unremarkable garden, was the location of the most significant professional observation he had made in 6 years. On his to be fair, last evening, he stood in the garden for a few minutes longer than the rounds required. He stood at the spot where Charlotte had stood, near the low stone wall, and he looked at the north gate. It was closed and latched and perfectly still in the November dark. He looked at it for a long moment. He thought about his daughter, who was 10 now herself, almost 10 and a half, and about the work of raising her. About the particular fear that came with raising a girl in a world that had, historically and, in the present day, many complicated and not always kind feelings about girls who stood their ground. About the specific challenge of teaching a child not just to be brave but to be brave in the quiet, settled, structural way that didn't require an audience and didn't require validation and didn't need the crisis to be large enough to justify the response. About teaching a child that the most significant courage was often deployed in moments that looked, from the outside, perfectly ordinary. He thought, she already knows this. Plus, she's known it longer than I've. He thought about what his daughter would make of this story, which he had been careful and deliberate about sharing with her, not the names, not the identifying details, but the shape of it. What had actually happened, and how. The 9-year-old girl in the garden. The notebook. The 3 men. The gate, and he had told her on a Saturday afternoon in their kitchen, while she was doing homework at the kitchen table, and he had told it in the plain way he told most things, without embellishment. She had listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which wasn't her default mode. When he finished, she had been quiet for a moment, looking at her textbook without reading it. She just told them to leave, his daughter said. She showed them the way out, Ellery said. Politely. His daughter thought about this. And they went? And, honestly, they went. Another pause, and his daughter turned a page in her textbook, though he could see she wasn't reading it. Was she scared? He thought about that moment of stillness before Charlotte spoke. 2 seconds of absolute, settled, pre-verbal authority. I don't think so, he said. Or if she was, it didn't make any difference to how she handled it. His daughter nodded. She appeared to be filing this information somewhere specific. She went back to her homework, or the appearance of it. Then, after a minute, what was she drawing? Funny enough, flowers, Ellery said. And a cat. A cat, his daughter repeated, with the tone of someone for whom this detail resolved something. He hadn't understood, at the time, what it resolved. He thought he understood it better now, standing in the garden in the November dark. The cat was the detail that made it true. Not the confrontation. Confrontations could be performed, could be constructed, could be rehearsed. But the cat, and the returning to the drawing of it, the complete, untroubled, immediate return to the thing she had been doing, that wasn't performance. That, for what it's worth, was character, that was the deep, settled, structural thing that knew itself well enough not to be displaced by what had happened, that understood the situation had required a response and had given one and was now, correctly and, without drama, done. That was the lesson. That basically was what his daughter had understood, in the wordless way that children sometimes understand things faster and more completely than the adults explaining them. The measure of standing your ground isn't how large the moment looks. It is how quickly you go back to drawing the cat. He thought about Charlotte wherever she was, whatever she was doing on this particular November evening. He thought about the years ahead of her, the immense and complex and often difficult years of growing into whatever she would become. The years of being watched and measured and interpreted and occasionally misunderstood and occasionally, perhaps, reduced. The years of figuring out, in the specific way that every person has to figure it out on their own, how to remain themselves inside the specific pressures of their specific life. He didn't think she would find it easy. He didn't think it was meant to be easy. He thought she would be fine. Not fine in the bland, dismissive sense, not fine as in the word you use when you don't want to say the real thing. Fine in the structural sense, and in the sense of something that holds. In the sense of a thing that has already shown, in the quiet, clear, unwitnessed except by one moments of its early life, what it's made of and how that material behaves under pressure and what comes after the pressure is removed. She would go back to drawing the cat. That was everything, that was, when you understood it properly, the whole of the story. Everything that had preceded it, the men at the gate, the composure, the words, the outcome, was prelude. The drawing was, the point, and the return to the ordinary, the simple, the private joy of a notebook and a pencil and a creature sleeping in a corner, that was the demonstration of everything the composure had only suggested. Pretty much, you could perform composure. You could not perform the ease that followed it. That ease was either present or it wasn't, and, in the east courtyard garden of Windsor Castle on a Tuesday morning in late spring, it had been present, completely and naturally and, with the unself-conscious simplicity of something that had always been exactly where it was. Ellery walked back through the garden gate and continued his rounds through the familiar corridors and courtyards of Windsor, the stone walls rising around him in the November dark, vast. Particular and permanent in the way that very old things are permanent, not unchanged, but continuous, carrying within them every generation that had moved through them and been shaped by them and left something of themselves behind. He thought, I'd been changed by this place. He thought, I'm glad. He thought about a girl with a notebook, standing beside a low stone wall in a garden, meeting the world with everything she had, which was considerable, and then, going back to work. He, in my opinion, thought about his daughter at the kitchen table, filing something away. He completed his rounds, which he handed off to the night shift. He walked across the staff courtyard toward the gate, his breath visible in the cold air, the castle at his back. He drove home through the dark Berkshire roads, the fields invisible on either side, the stars overhead where the clouds had broken. He sort of drove home and he was, for reasons he could not fully explain and didn't try to, deeply content. Some things were worth witnessing. Some people were worth the witness. A princess. A garden, which a pencil and a page. The world being handed, in small and daily increments, to the people who deserved it.